I'm going to turn it over to our keynote speaker. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. David Kizirian. He's a curatorial associate in the Department of Herpetology and Division of Vertebrate Zoology at the American Museum of Natural History.
Thank you. So I'm sure I don't need to explain the concept of mutualism to this crowd, but show of hands, how many of y'all have heard of autocatalysis? Is that something that y'all have? So there are a handful of you, right? So what I want to try to do today is to convince you that autocatalysis is probably the most important process that you've never heard of. And so what I'm going to do for the first part of this is talk about a corner of ecological theory known as process ecology, and give you a primer on that field before I talk about how I've used some of those ideas to address some evolutionary questions. So mutualism, we understand. What is autocatalytic or autocatalysis? The term actually originated in chemistry and was applied to chemical reactions which were catalyzed by products of the reaction. And we've since discovered what we think are autocatalytic pathways everywhere from cells to cities across the entire biological hierarchy. Here we have an example from ecology involving a carnivorous aquatic bladderwort, and you can see there's an individual plant on the left side there, and all of the action is below the surface of the water on the roots. And you see there are these little bladder-like structures on the roots, which are actually zooplankton traps. And so if you go over here to the right then, the way this works is, as the plant grows, it increases surface area for a periphyton layer, which includes bacteria and other things. The periphyton layer is eaten by the zooplankton, and as the zooplankton is cruising along the plant, eating up the periphyton layer, it occasionally bumps into one of these hair-like structures that sucks the hapless zooplankton into that utricle, that bladder-like structure, where it is digested, and then those nutrients lead to more growth of the plant. More growth of the plant creates more surface area for the periphyton layer, which is more food for the zooplankton, which is more food for the plant, and round it goes, right? Leading to more and more matter and energy being drawn into the system at a faster and faster rate. Now, as I said, autocatalytic pathways have been observed everywhere from cells to cities. We have here an example on the right, a familiar example involving two key processes inside of cells, photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and both of those have within them autocatalytic pathways. And in fact, the entirety of cell metabolism has been regarded by some to be a large autocatalytic network. What you see on the right is a figure from Rosnay, 1975, who mapped out ecosystems, and what you see are these mutualisms like the one I've circled in red. So you have a mutualistic relationship between the workforce and the employer. You work, you get paid, and those kinds of mutualistic relationships make up the entire system. They're couplets, and taken together, you end up with a mutualistic network where there are feedback pathways, both clockwise and counterclockwise. So it's kind of a cascade effect. As soon as you have mutualisms, that opens the door for feedback, which opens the door for autocatalysis, and also countercurrent autocatalysis. It just kind of evolves very quickly once the mutualisms kick in. So here are more figures from Rosnay that I use to kind of show the evolution of the economic system that's centered on Manhattan Island. So obviously, in the early days, for example, there were few occupations. You were a hunter-gatherer, you were a farmer, maybe one of the farmers knew something, first aid or whatever, but there were very few choices as far as occupation goes. That was the nature of the economy. But over time, the economy at the end of Manhattan Island, for example, evolved into a much larger system. And at the same time, all of these properties that you see listed down below kind of cascade from the development or evolution of that autocatalytic economy. So here on the far right might represent New York City at the present time, where, as before, we had one farmer who knew something about first aid. Now we have doctors for all of your body parts, even parts of your parts. So increasing complexity is one of the key things that we see in the evolution and maturity of biological systems from cells to cities. You can literally look at any one of those systems, and as they mature and evolve, you will see these properties that I've listed below, including things like complexity, stability, efficiency, which are pretty straightforward. And then there are some abstract properties like autonomy, agency, and emergence that we also see evolving in those systems. A coral reef is kind of an ideal system to observe some of these properties of biological systems that are driven by autocatalysis. Reefs have been called species factories, and what that means is that the complexity or the diversity of the reef drives yet more complexity, right? Now, up till now, most of the terms and ideas that I have been talking about are not particularly new. Autocatalysis dates back to the 1800s, for example, and all these other ecological terms are familiar to you. So this subdiscipline of process ecology then is not entirely new, but it's the integration of those ideas in a slightly different way that takes on kind of a new vibe, right? So there is an exception to that, which is the term centripetality, which was coined by one of the key investigators, key promoters of process ecology, and he used this term for the matter and energy that is recruited into a system as a result of autocatalytic mutualisms. So for example, here in this coral reef, so much matter and energy has been sucked into this system that you can see the dang thing from space, right? And there are many other cases of this kind of accumulation that are examples of that centripetality, right? Including honeycombs and cities. If you look at a honeycomb, for example, those are jam-packed full of carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, information, right? They're a very dense concentration of all of that matter and energy. And of course, even places like cities that you can see here. Now, one of the clues that autocatalysis is at play is exponential growth, right? And you can see all of these research has shown that they are, at least in part, autocatalytic, which drives that massive recruitment of matter and energy into the system. And once you kind of key into that clue, right, that if you see exponential growth in a biological system, you can bet that somewhere embedded in the dynamics of that system, there's going to be some autocatalytic drive. Once you see it, you can't not see it. You start seeing it everywhere. This is a news bit that caught my eye a couple of weeks ago, and it was talking about faster sea level rise. So I went into the article, and sure enough, it mentions that the melting of glaciers might be accelerating the rate of sea level rise. And if you go into the original paper, you could see that they mention feedback, which is key to autocatalysis, and they also mention rate doubling, so exponential growth. Nowhere in this paper did they say autocatalysis or did they cite any of that ecological literature, but these two clues kind of tell you that it's evolving in a similar fashion. And I don't know how much climate scientists are paying attention or considering autocatalysis, but in this paper published in 1996, they thought that by 2025, there should be a 1-degree increase in global temperature, mean global temperature. And we're at right about 1.15 now, right? Also notice down below, they say, it's also possible there could be an autocatalytic component to global warming, right? What does that mean? That means that at some point we might see some autocatalytic mechanism kick in where global temperatures might increase at greater than expected rates. And is the melting of glaciers part of that process? Possibly so. Maybe somebody smarter than I should look into it. Okay, as I mentioned, complexity is one of the key emergent variables or factors that we see in autocatalytic systems. And what these guys argued is that that complexity as diversity kind of evolves naturally if you let the thing alone. It actually takes active manipulation to reduce the complexity that you see in the system. So it's a natural, expected property of biological systems, of economies, that they will become more complex, i.e. more diverse over time. And they ultimately argue that inclusive economic and political systems, what they did was they kind of compared nations that were kind of similar, population size, resources, and what they found is those that had inclusive political and economic policies tended to succeed over those that were extractive or exclusive. So this field of process ecology also, as I said, just kind of takes a slightly different view. It takes everything that we know about ecology and kind of turns it and looks at the whole package in a slightly different way. And one of the issues that it clarifies, if you want to look at it that way, is the role of competition in ecological systems. So that the role of competition has been kicked around, debated over many decades, and what emerges from process ecology is that competition is something that emerges out of mutualism. You have to have mutualisms in place in order for systems to compete with like systems. For example, a baseball team does not win baseball games unless you have coordinated play among the players on the team, right? Here is an example, sidebar. I went to Vietnam to do some field work, and we needed to buy some plastic buckets to build pitfall traps. And so my Vietnamese colleagues took me to the part of town where you buy plastic buckets. And when I got there, it was like these tiny little vendors, one after another, side by side, selling plastic products. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. Doesn't it make more sense to have these things kind of spread out evenly across the city? And one of my friends said, oh, no, no, no. It's like, if you need plastic buckets, you go to the part of town where they sell plastic buckets. So there's a kind of mutualism by having all of those vendors kind of co-located. This is an example, a similar example, involving some clothing stores. There are 7 tiny little clothing stores side by side here, 4 of which sell pink tops, right? So you go to the part of town where you can expect to buy pink tops, you get there, and then at that point, competition emerges between the vendors, But underlying that competition, you're just like, okay, this one's better, this one fits better, this one costs what I want to pay, right? Underlying that competition is this fundamental mutualism that brought you to that part of town in the first place. So all of these vendors benefit by being side by side. Oh, another point here. So in this context, we see competition among like systems. Cells compete with other cells. Organisms compete with other organisms. Species compete with other species, et cetera. And folks in economics have embraced these ideas, and they talk about competition between ecosystems, but what they're talking about is like a business or some sort of economic adventure. It's somewhat ironic that you rarely see research looking at competition between sort of traditional kinds of ecosystems like you see here. In this paper, they cited competition between heath and forest, right? And it's the only paper that I could find that included the phrase competition between ecosystems. So it's a little bit ironic that you don't see so much of this in ecology, but we see it at every other level of the biological hierarchy. So one last thing that I want to say about process ecology, autocatalytic mutualisms in general, has to do with this idea that all of the dynamics of these systems tend to optimize variables, right? So in an economic system, for example, it's maybe not the best thing to strive for maximum profits. Maybe what this theory predicts is it's better to optimize profits because that's better for the health of the larger system. And so if you start looking at ecosystems, and even when you talk about evolutionary processes, you make that switch between maximizing or like reducing predation, for example. It's maybe better to say optimizing predation in a system rather than maximizing or minimizing it, depending on where you're at. Okay, so full disclosure. For the first 55 years of my life, I have had only maybe a passing interest in mimicry, right? But what brought me to this point was a paper that I was writing on species concepts. Now, my expertise is a poorly known group of neotropical lizards called Gymnophthalmidae, and maybe Maria Strongus, you're here, right? She's probably the only person in the room that knows what I'm talking about when I say that, right? But because I was writing this paper on species models, right, I showed this thing to millions of people to get their feedback on it. And somebody that I showed it to, I don't know who, I can't remember who it was, I wish I could, said, you should check out some papers in process ecology or papers by this guy, Ulanowitz. And the reason is because I had emphasized in this, oops, it's kind of turning off. I had emphasized in my model this processes that integrate species as systems, which overlaps greatly with some of these ideas in process ecology. So y'all know probably how this works. Over here on the far left is a famous figure from a famous paper on mimicry. The way mimicry systems work is you have a model, a toxic model, right, like a coral snake, and over time, what happens there is a non-toxic species that evolves similarity to this toxic model to avoid predation. I've said it kind of in a weird way to make it short, right? But I think you understand how these systems work in general, right? But that wasn't really enough to draw me into the problem, right? But what did catch my eye at some point was there was a paper in the 80s where they said, it looks like mimicry systems evolve at an accelerated rate compared to other kinds of evolutionary systems. That caught my eye. Also, some papers were saying that feedback was involved. So I decided that I needed to look at this, maybe in the context of process ecology, to address some of the long-standing problems or questions in the field of mimicry. So I'm not a mimicry guy, right? Just, again, full disclosure. What I found is that there was a lot of literature on the relationship between the toxic model and the mimic. There are a whole lot of papers that address that particular part of the equation. But there were very few papers that addressed the relationship between the mimic and the predator. And that's kind of that's represented by the shaded green arrow here. And I thought, well, if there's feedback going on in this system, there must be something, there must be some process going on between the predator and the mimic. And so I started trying to map out all of the processes that might be relevant to this issue and found this kind of missing link in the feedback circuit, right? So we've completed the feedback circuit with this process. And specifically what it is when predators feed on mimics, right? When the predators eat the mimics, they're not toxic, that results in selection for predation on that mimetic phenotype. That keeps the predators feeding on the models, right? So once I had this completed feedback circuit, I started mapping other processes, including things like nutrient transfer, which is not something that is generally done in the mimicry literature, and also kind of indirect benefits. So processes directly related to mimicry, but then processes that are not quite directly related to it. And also things like efficiency. So for example, predation might have an obvious detrimental effect on one of the prey species, but there might be kind of a backwards benefit for the system as a whole. And what I ended up doing was what you see here at the bottom, right? And I ended up with kind of a Rossnay type diagram that showed a clockwise pathway of benefits, a counterclockwise pathway of benefits, including more kinds of processes than had previously been included in studies of mimicry. What my colleagues and I realized is that we had kind of redefined Batesian mimicry. Batesian mimicry is where you have a toxic model and a non-toxic mimic. And for decades, maybe a century, folks have regarded that relationship as parasitic, right? The model doesn't get anything out of the mimicking the phenotype, but it turns out if you map out all of the beneficial pathways in the entire feedback circuit, if you include processes related to efficiency, for example, and culling of variation and preserving of variation, overall, Batesian mimicry is largely mutualistic rather than being parasitic. Also, once we had our feedback loop, the processes mapped out, we could answer some questions, long-standing questions regarding this kind of unexpected variation that you see in mimetic systems. For example, I mentioned earlier that some have argued that mimetic systems evolve at an accelerated rate, right? Okay, where have we heard that before, right? Once you have a feedback loop, as I mentioned earlier, you open the door for self-accelerating positive feedback, right? Here, we have two feedback pathways, clockwise, counterclockwise, and perhaps those together might explain why we see accelerated evolution in mimetic systems. Another question that we addressed was the existence of imperfect mimics. This has always been a puzzle for mimicry, right? It's regarded as an anomaly because if you think about it, if you have a mimetic system, right, if there's selection for the non-toxic species looking like the toxic species, over time, that you would expect that phenotypic similarity to be nearly perfect. And we never see that. Even in the cases that you can see here, there is a lot of what are termed in the literature imperfect mimics, right? So what we propose with this kind of feedback model is that, well, no, you don't really expect that kind of perfection of on the phenotype. Instead, the system optimizes, right? So some of the processes in the system cull variation, right? So you are, in some cases, going to cull imperfect mimics, but there are other processes in the system that select for predation on imperfect mimics. And so you get a preservation of variation in the system that's necessary for the system to evolve long term, right? So you're optimizing the amount of variation in the system. You're not eliminating perfect mimics. You're optimizing the phenotype, and that means the mimetic system as a whole, as a separate whole thing, can evolve and persist long term. Okay. That was a lot of yakking for one slide, I know, sorry. So the mimicry stuff has been accepted for publication. What I'm working on now is not, so I'm not going to say a whole lot about it. Most of y'all, maybe nearly everybody, will recognize this figure as being one that you usually find in the very first chapter of an intro bio textbook. It's the hierarchy of biological organization. And all of them look very similar, right? They have very similar features to them. And so what I'm doing now is kind of reconsidering this model in the context of systems / process ecology. And that's all I'm going to say about that. All right, so the work on mimicry, we think we can argue that those are mutualistic systems rather than parasitic systems. And we can explain with this process ecology feedback model some of the puzzlements that have perpetuated in the literature, including things like imperfect mimics, right, and accelerated evolution, right? So another sidebar here. In addition to my job at the museum, I also teach intro bio classes at LaGuardia Community College. It's a course for non-majors, and a lot of these kids do not care about critters at all, right? They're not really interested in these sorts of things. But because I'm using this process model, which argues that everything from cells to cities are integrated in similar fashions, I find that, beginning the semester talking about systems that they're familiar with, like maybe the company where they work or the city that they live in, gives them a good foundation for understanding the processes that integrate traditional kinds of biological systems like cells, organisms, and species. I also, at the beginning of every class, I present science news. So it's very new research. Basically, it's stuff we didn't know last week. And I do that for a specific reason. Well, it makes it interesting, I think. But also, I think it's important for the students to understand that science is very dynamic. And the systems that we study are very dynamic. And this figure here, this image of the hyena in front of the dumpster, was from one of those news bits, and it's one of my favorites because it kind of touches on an important point regarding the evolution of autocatalytic biological systems, right? And it speaks to kind of their dynamic, spontaneous nature. So in Mekelle, Ethiopia, what they found was that hyenas eating carcasses from the trash, right, resulted in a decrease in anthrax and tuberculosis in the city of Mekelle. And I was like, that's amazing, right? Now, if you had been at a town meeting and they're like, you know what, we got this anthrax problem. I know, why don't we introduce hyenas into the neighborhoods and see if that helps? You'd be labeled a lunatic, right? But this mutualistic relationship emerged spontaneously. It's highly localized, and it's not one of those things you can really predict. And so my point is that these mutualisms that we're talking about are not just, you know, the long tongue of the bat has evolved to suck nectar out of this long flower tube. These are not just long-standing evolutionary stories. They are ecological, spontaneous, in-the-moment kinds of things. And lastly, this image here is taken from a paper that was published, I think, on the 22nd, right? And as barcoders know, right, there are two genomes in your cells. There's the mitochondrial genome, which you use for your barcoding, right? And there's the nuclear genome. That's the result of an endosymbiotic event that's ages and ages old, right? What these guys found recently in an algal cell are 7 unique genomes, right? So this is a mutualistic story involving 7 different critters. And my point is, of course, that mutualisms are where it's at, really, when you're talking about biology and even evolutionary biology. And so the last point I will make is, get back to circle around to something I said earlier. Perhaps ecology has the answers to all the questions in biology. From the very first cell, when that first cell was organized, at that exact moment, the first ecosystem also evolved. Right? Organisms are ecosystems, as we are learning from the study of our own microbiomes. Species are host ecosystems for their parasites. Right? Corporations and cities are also essentially ecosystems driven primarily by one biological species, Homo sapiens. So perhaps ecology can explain nearly everything that's happened on planet Earth for the last 4 billion years. Thank you.